This is Harold H. Wesche. Harold Hazelton Wesche, bringing to you an oral history of myself, my wife and children, and the Wesche family that I grew up in. And I basically started out in Hayward, Wisconsin. I was born in Ashland, Wisconsin, on the shore of Lake Superior. I was born on July 10th, 1936. My dad was an intern. He had just finished medical school and he was an intern in Duluth, Minnesota. And my mom was living in Hayward with her dad, Grandpa Hazelton, Dr. Walter A. Hazelton. So when I was born in Ashland, I'm not sure how long we stayed in the hospital, Mom and I, but when we went home, we went to Hayward. And my dad would come home from Duluth on weekends to see us. And he would pick me up and he would say, "How's my little buddy boy?" And somehow I just started being called Buddy. And as I got older, of course, it changed to Bud. I lived in Hayward 9 years and 9 months before we moved to Idaho. Those were wonderful years, wonderful memories. In fact, I have such vivid memories of some of the things there that I even have memories of smells and sounds and all sorts of things. It was just a wonderful place to grow up. I'm so thankful for my mom and dad. My dad was Dr. Gerald Ernest Wesche. My mom was Minnie Louise Hazelton Wesche. My grandpa was alive for most of the time that we lived in Hayward. My grandma, his wife, Grandma Minnie Mae Miller Hazelton, had passed away about 6 months before I was born. So I never did get to know her. But I had a wonderful heritage, and we went to a little Wesleyan Methodist church in Hayward that Grandpa Hazelton had been a founding member of. In 2004, I took my family, Sunday and John and Annie, back to Hayward on a trip to see where I grew up. The church had long since moved to a new building, but we met the pastor and I became friends with him and corresponded a lot with him in the years to come. But one thing I noticed is that, like so many churches today, they had gone completely over to a contemporary type service with a so-called worship team and guitars and drums and all that stuff. The church I grew up in had a piano and possibly a small organ. And we sang the great old hymns of the faith out of hymnals. And that's what I like. That's what I prefer. That's what I grew up with. And I just can't get used to this worldly way of, just copying the world in so many ways. And I don't care for that at all. Anyway, I have a lot of great memories of Hayward. The Hayward Elementary School that I went to was about 7.5 blocks from home. We lived in a great big house, just a wonderful house, have fond memories of it. And it was at the corner of Highway 63 and California Avenue. When we went back in 2004, the house had been moved to a new location, and we did find it and took pictures of it. Later, I connected with the current owner, and he gave us an invitation anytime we were back there to come and see it, which I would love to have done, but I don't think I'll ever make it back there again. But the original house was at California Avenue and Highway 63, and it was about 7.5 blocks from school and about 8.5 blocks from the church, and it was about 2.5 blocks from my dad's office. Dad and Grandpa had a Hazelton Wesche clinic, or doctor's office, on 2nd Street, about half a block from Main Street. When we were there in 2004, we went through it, and they invited us to look around and brought back so many memories. But it is now a rock shop where they sell rocks and gems and that sort of thing. When we lived in that big house, I had a wonderful place to play. We owned quite a bit of land with it, and there was a creek that ran through our property, and on the opposite side of the creek from the house was an old barn. It wasn't used for anything. It was just there on the property, although my dad did store some things in there that we didn't have room in the house to store and weren't perhaps that valuable. But one thing that was valuable to him that he stored over there got stolen, and that was his set of cadaver bones from medical school. He had boiled the bones to get all anything off that would decay, and then he shellacked all the bones, and it was a beautiful set of human bones, and someone broke into the barn and stole those. He was very sad about that. Just to the north of the barn was kind of a little woodsy area, and one or two of the big trees had fallen over somehow in a storm. I think that's how it happened. I don't think they were cut down. And as a boy, I could go over there and climb up on those, and being parallel to the ground pretty much, I could crawl out or even walk out on those quite a ways and then sit down on it and bounce up and down. It was quite fun to get that thing really going and bounce me pretty high in the air. In the backyard, my dad built a wonderful play area for us and had it all fenced in, and he had some really tall, nice swings and teeter-totter, a chinning bar, and it was quite a nice playground area. I think he had a patient of his build it on their account. They couldn't pay him cash, and he let them build that for at least part of their payment. There's a wonderful backyard to play in, and just on the other side of the fence, outside of the fenced-in area. My dad helped me build a tower, and we put up several 4x4s, had anchored them pretty good in the ground, and he helped me get a basic frame up, and then I put a floor on it, put walls around it, and made a tower. I had hours and hours of fun playing in that tower. And that's where I got the idea that I wanted to build my own kids a tower someday. And in fact, when we lived in Nampa at Tan Oak, 413 Tan Oak Circle, I did build them a tower. And it was even nicer than the one I had as a boy. It was just a great place for the kids to play. And Annie could get up there too, although she was much littler than Johnny, but Johnny just loved going up there to play. But we had a neighbor that was real cranky, and this was in Nampa, and the tower I built for the kids, he didn't like some reason because it was high enough that they could see over the fence into his yard, and he thought they were spying on him all the time, and it was pretty sad. He threatened to take us to court and sue us and call the police and all kinds of things. So, in deference to his wishes and to be peacemakers, we did take it down. But the kids had fun with it for a while. And I left we took the platform down from the tower, but I left a couple of the poles up and hooked a hammock up between them, so it wasn't totally in vain. Well, and they did have fun with it for quite a while too. But back to Hayward. My tower in Hayward was a lot of fun for me. I don't remember that my sisters ever climbed up there. The house was very large with, let's see, we had 4 bedrooms upstairs and my parents' bedroom downstairs. And we had different people live in sort of a little apartment we made upstairs. Grandpa Hazelton lived there for a little while until he got married to Grandma Kate, step-grandma. And then they moved into a little home that they rented. But we had a couple of teachers from the school live there for a while. Two single ladies, the first and the second grade teachers. I had them both as teachers in school. I don't remember the first grade teacher's name, but the second grade teacher's name was Miss Grimm. But she was very nice. They both were. My best friend in grade school there was Tom Wilkins, Tommy Wilkins. He was about 1 month younger than I was, and we were good friends. Later, after we moved away, he, instead of going to the church we went to, they went to a Lutheran church, and so when it came time to go to college, he went to a Lutheran college that was pretty liberal, and he became very liberal in his theology. And because of that, he also became liberal in his politics. And we've kept in touch over the years, but we are very, very different in both our theology and our politics. We had a lot of good neighbors Next door to us was a banker and his wife and daughter. His name was Scipio Wise, and they owned a building that I think was part of the building. My dad's office was part of the building that he owned. It was called the Wise Building for some reason. And on Main Street, there were a lot of businesses that were very good memories of the many stores and different things. There's Rivkin's store was one of our favorites. There were, I think, 4 grocery stores, plus the co-op, where you could also buy groceries. Hayward was quite a bit of a tourist town in the summer, and in the fall during hunting season. A lot of the rich Chicago people would come up there for vacations in the summer. Some of them owned vacation homes on the lakes. A lot of beautiful lakes. Big Round Lake was our favorite. We would go there about 2 weeks every summer and stay in a cabin. And my dad would drive into town. It was about 10 miles away. He'd drive into town to work some of the days because he was the only doctor. Well, he and Grandpa were the only doctors in town. And so he didn't take off the full 2 weeks, but he'd come out in the evenings and have dinner and sleep out there with us. And we had a wonderful time. You could row out in the boat, and it was a spring-fed lake, Big Round Lake, and you could row out there, and it was so clear you could look down and see the fish swimming around, and they'd swim up to your hook, and you'd say, "Come on, bite it," and just watch them and coax them to take the bait. But it was just a great place. And then there was another big spring-fed lake called La Coudray. We never stayed there, but it was a very nice lake. When we went back in 2004 with Sunday and the kids, we stayed at a lake called Nelson Lake. But Nelson Lake was strictly a reservoir. It was a man-made lake formed by a earth dam. And when I was a boy, I can't remember which year, but I must have been, maybe 7 years old or so. We had the Great Hayward Flood, and the dam on Nelson Lake broke, and the water came roaring out, and the creek that ran behind our house was one of the main, not the only one, but one of the main outlets to that reservoir, and it drained into Lake Hayward across the highway from where our house was. But with the dam washing out, the water just came down in such large amounts that the creek couldn't hold it, and our basement flooded. But our house was fine, but the basement flooded a little. But we had some strong guys come over and haul stuff out of the basement so it wouldn't get damaged. The flood flooded the basement of my dad's office too, and he was able to rescue a lot of the supplies that they had stored down there. But it was quite an event in the history of Hayward. I remember it quite well. I don't think my sisters do. My sisters were younger by intervals of about 3 years. Jerry Lou, her name was Geraldine Louise, and we called her Jerry Lou. She was 3 years younger than I was. Patricia Ann, we called her Patty. She was 6 years younger than I was. And then Alice Jean came along a little bit earlier than a 3-year interval. She came at 2.5 years below Patricia, or 8.5 years younger than me. And she was born on a rather unique date. If you use the number 1 for January, she was born on the 23rd. So, and it was in 1945. So she was born on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's rather unique. I remember Sunday's brother Jim had a unique one as well. He was born on April 4th of 1944, so it was 4/4/44. But I like mine best, July 10, 1936. That was a wonderful date to have a birthday on. So Hayward had a lot of fond memories. We had a Wesleyan Methodist campground where they'd have camp meetings every summer for, I can't remember, I think it was 10 days to 2 weeks. They'd have morning, afternoon, and evening preaching messages. They had dorms there that people could live in or bring their tents to camp in and so on. They'd come up from all around that part of Wisconsin. And I can remember my mom taking a shortcut through the woods to go to some of the services during the day with me, and I don't know if I don't suppose all my sisters went because Alice was too young, but perhaps my younger siblings were staying with a girl that did a lot of nanny work for us. We had several different girls who helped my mom out around the home and took care of us kids and so forth. One of them, her name was Dolores, and she married a man named Melvin Sipes. I'm not sure if there's an S on the end. It might just be Sipe. Melvin Sipe. Very sadly, many, many years later, they were murdered by an Indian boy from the reservation that was hooked on drugs, and he was looking for drugs or drug money, and he broke into their house and beat them up and killed them. Very sad. But they were both strong believers, so they're with the Lord. Then we had another girl that had helped us out. Her name was Elaine Graham, and her parents were patients of my dad's in a nearby town. And when we moved to Idaho, she wanted to move with us, and we could use her help, so we let her move with us. And when we moved, we had a moving van that packed up all our belongings and brought them out to Nampa. But my dad put a big top carrier on the car. It was a two-door Chevrolet sedan, and we packed in there Elaine Graham, my mom and dad, and us 4 kids. Alice was, I think, only about a little over 1 year old. And she sat on somebody's lap all the time. But I think we took 3 days for the trip to drive to Idaho. And the moving van had gotten there way before we did, and the previous owners hadn't fully moved out yet. So they unloaded all of our stuff into a closed-in porch. So when we got there, we got everything from the porch and set it up in the house. But I think the first night we stayed with my Uncle Henry, who was in medical practice there, and he'd been the one to convince us to move out to Nampa and have my dad go into practice with him. But I can remember that when my dad told Grandpa Hazelton that we were going to move, he was kind of sad that we were leaving, but he understood. But he didn't live much longer after that. He died in November of 1945. I think it was on the 11th. And we moved in early April in 1946. I can remember the night that Grandpa died. He knew he was going to die. He was a doctor. He knew he had heart trouble. And he could just sense that his time was coming that night. He told my mom to bring us kids over to say goodbye to us. We gathered around his bed, and he asked us to sing "Jesus Loves Me, This I Know, for the Bible tells me so." And we all sang that to him. And he told us each one goodbye, that he loved us and he would see us one day in heaven. And he gave us our Christmas presents early. That was November, and he knew he wouldn't be there for Christmas. And that night he did go to be with the Lord. And his funeral was a few days later. And an interesting story that relates to his funeral is that years earlier, Grandpa had saved the life of the Indian chief's son. Now, the Indian reservation was probably 10 miles from Hayward, and they did have a government Indian doctor there, but he was many times drunk and not available, and they would call Grandpa. And Grandpa saved the life of Chief Johnny Frog's son. And Chief Johnny Frog never forgot that. And he walked in. He heard that Dr. Hazelton had died, and he didn't have a car. He walked in about 10 miles from the Indian reservation to Grandpa's funeral. And he got to the church, and the church was so packed out with people he couldn't get in. But someone kindly offered to give him a ride out to the cemetery to the service at the cemetery. And then they took him home. They gave him a ride home afterwards. But that story was written up in the Hayward paper, the Sawyer County Record, I have a clipping of it somewhere. But Grandpa Hazelton was dearly loved, and we, after he passed away, a few months later, we did move to Nampa. So there are many, many fond memories of Hayward. I could tell you many other stories. When my family went with me in 2004 to visit Hayward again, Johnny and I went out to visit Al Capone's hideout. And it had become a tourist attraction, and they charged money to show you around, give you a tour. But it reminded me of the time when my dad told me that he'd been called out there to one of Al Capone's gangster friends was sick, and my dad was called out to give him medical attention. And that could be kind of a scary thing, except he knew that they took really good care of two groups of people, their cooks and their doctors. And they treated him quite well. He'd been out there a few times. Another interesting story that my mom told was when Dad was in medical school, they had an apartment in a big home in Madison, and someone else living in another apartment in the same house was one of Al Capone's men. They didn't know it at the time, but later, after the police raided the place, they discovered that they'd been living there with a gangster all that time. A lot of interesting gangster stories in northern Wisconsin, because the Chicago gangsters had a hideout up there, and they would come up there. In fact, they had some of their real battles up there in the North Woods, in the Drummond Woods and so on. Another interesting thing about northern Wisconsin was that my dad was born in a little tiny town called Moquah, Moquah. And I took my family there to see it in 2004, and the original house is not there anymore, but there was a memorial, a little memorial park set up to the pioneers who pioneered in the Moquah area. And of course, my grandpa Wesche was one of those pioneers, and he ran the little store and post office there for quite a while, and did some farming, logging. And he had a sawmill at one time. Did a lot of sawing of, they cut down trees and saw them into lumber. So many, many fond memories of Hayward growing up. Then we moved to Idaho and had a new set of fond memories. Hayward still was one of my favorite places, but I am glad that we moved to Idaho, because it was in Idaho where I met my wife, my beloved Sunday. And that'll be a story for another chapter. So I'm going to close this chapter for now, and then we'll have another one shortly here.